This year we completed the shelter belt plantings for the entire croft across 5 acres around the entire perimeter. That has taken over 10,000 trees. This video is the how and where of all the species we used throughout the whole system. So in this section here, this is the first section that went in. This is the outer skin. This is Italian alder. It's a very fast nitrogen fixer. This went in 5 years ago and they were bare root sticks about this long. I think some of them now are up to 15-20 feet. This section just in the car park is a single row of them, but as we go further in, we've got a double row of them, really densely planted. They're planted on a zigzag so that by the time these get up, and these will touch 100 feet within a few years, you know, significant shelter from this point. So in terms of orientation, that way is north, that way is south. This is the dominant wind, so these trees will never be pruned. Throughout the rest of the system, we've got alder, common alder, but these ones being Italian alder, they're more tolerant of drought than the others. Now, when we got this land, this originally was a much wetter spot than it is now, so we wanted to put alder in, but it's going to dry out over time because of the earthworks that we've put in. It shunts the water off in that direction, so these will be tolerant of this as it dries out as well. So there's a good fit here. On the other side of the shelter belt, you can just about make out there's a row of red willow with a wire above it. As it comes up, that'll be taken off at an angle. It'll be wound around the wound around the wire, and that'll be a nice sculptural element that'll run right through this whole system, right up as far as the barn, basically. And either side of the camera here, there's some willow that'll make a nice dome. So this is an entire, sorry, not a dome, an arch. So this whole section here is an entire chunk of shelter belt. The alder is the outer skin, the willow is the inner skin. Now the alder hangs onto its leaves really late into the year. I think it was December before we lost the leaves off the alder this year, and that was through days of 50-60 miles an hour wind at times. It's a really good tree here. These, brilliant. They're the best performing trees we've got. So I'm really pleased with them. I definitely use them again. But that's just the outer skin. On the inside, we've got the willow. Now the willow, that leaves out really early, puts out pollinators, its flowers nice and early, really good as a pollinator attractant. Everything between is relatively wind hardy through this section here, but is also productive. So we've got, so let's think, we've got a morello cherry, because as the trees come up, of course, things will start to become a bit more shaded in here. So this is morello cherry. This has been a real star in terms of wind fastness. This is a checkers, which is a close relative of ash. Got a certain amount of this sort of thing coming in. This is just a simple pine tree. It's just a nurse crop. It's not going to be here for very long, and so on through it. There's all sorts of stuff. It's a whole, whole system. I don't want to be about this. That's a cornelian cherry, for example. So as we walk through, there's layers and layers of production, really productive species inside the shelter belt itself. The willow will periodically get cut off down to the wire, just as like a pollarding. So we'll get a massive yield from that. Meanwhile, the Italian alder will keep getting bigger and bigger. Every time it leaf drops, every time it loses any sort of root die-off below ground, it'll share that, and especially in the leaves from these being a nitrogen fixer are loaded with nitrogen. So that feeds the production of everything else inside here. So we've got all sorts, we've got hazel, there's some ash there. So it's not all productive stuff, but mostly is. That again is another morello cherry. We've got elder, all sorts of stuff, and then below that there's things coming through different times of the year. There's lots of bulb crops coming through that at the moment provide, here for example, you can see the bluebells are in flower at the moment, but at other times of the year we've also got snowdrops, and we're just coming to the end now of the daffodil season. Those bulbs are unpleasant for rodents to dig through, so by having them spread freely, and they all divide freely underneath the trees, instead of a yield of like a root crop from the bottom layer of this whole system, instead the yield we've got is some rodent protection. So absolutely brilliant, and they just do their thing and duplicate year after year. So if you had a really bad vole year at any point, it wouldn't make quite the same impact that it would without them. There's a nice certain amount of rodent protection. As we keep going up, there's more and more and more. So you've got comfrey starting to come through. That's ready to be divided up. We've still got this willow on the outside as well. It's actually, already we're starting to feel the shelter of it. They're not completely leafed out yet, but they get in there. A huge amount of protection already from these. when they're in full leaf, you can see how close they are. I mean, they're basically intermeshed. So there's a massive, massive amount of protection from them already. You can have 40, 50 miles an hour and you actually think, oh, it's not too bad, until you come out of that shelter and it's like, oh yeah, it's windy. So we're already getting that benefit. So we got all sorts of stuff. We got what, loop in here, again, nitrogen fixation. So as we come through here, actually, you can see the red willow that we're using and just how long it is. So we're very close to the point that we can start tying it into the wire, and that'll look really nice at that point. It'll become more productive as well. Another willow arch here, and the alder continues right up and hits that barn. So from that angle, it's completely screened in. There's no winds can come in. From this point, of course, we've got the barn, which gives us 100% screening. It's beautiful. It's not our barn, but we get a lot of benefit from it. We get the water off the roof. Different video, but you know, that goes off through various earthworks and we get the benefit of that. But we also get a huge amount of protection for it from, especially because the wind, we don't really have a dominant wind as such, but tends to be a bit more from the southwest than other directions, but not by as much as it would in most places. Most of the UK, the wind comes from the southwest. Here, all directions, often on the same day. So the trees, you know, you'll see quite a few of them are flagged, but not necessarily in the same direction. It's a strange one. So at the top of the site here, it's like that way is south. So the top of the slope, we've got a general sort of northish sloping field, and the house is about halfway down. So we don't want anything up here in the shelter belt that's going to get too big, because even in winter, bare trees will cast a massive amount of shade. So on the inner line, we've got a row of hazel trees, then we've got a row of alder. This is common alder, the ones that are in the guards. And then we've got another row of hazel trees. Now these hazels are different ages, you know, all the way down. Some of these are actually from 2018, so the ones that are more like a good sized shrub now. Some of the others on the inside are a lot younger, like, let's have a look. This one here, you know, that's quite a bit younger. But there are hundreds, I genuinely haven't counted how many hazels we got. We've got an entire breeding program for them going on inside the shelter belt. So that's another yield from inside the shelter belt system, is a breeding program for hazels and chestnuts towards the other end of the site. The alder and the hazel can both be coppiced. So if they get up and they're getting too big and they're starting to cast too much shade further down in the system, we can take a yield of firewood from them, let them regenerate, and we keep doing that indefinitely on a cycle, and it's giving us multiple yields without you know, without damaging the trees, without causing any harm. Yeah, you can see the, was that the Spanish bluebell, I think? See, there's more bulbs coming through here. So there's a certain amount of below ground protection on all of these. This top strip of shelter belt, there's a bit of a gap between that and the edge of our land, which is that field. The reason for that, there's an old track comes through here. Anything we plant on it, there's not much survives. Most things fail because there's about maybe 6-7 inches of soil. Below that, it's nice topsoil, but below that is a layer of stone that was the previous track. Whoops. And that's really nice, good quality building stone. So over time, we're going to start using that as an asset, almost like a building material mine. And at that point, we'll probably be able to plant trees over it. They'll stand a better chance. But until then, it's just throwing trees at it. We're not going to do it. And, you know, no bad thing. You know, it's a decent chunk of land, actually, but we're in no rush to use it. It's 5 acres. It's a huge site. This whole section here has got things like, there's an elder that's just gone in as cutting. They do really well. We got, I don't know how many hundreds of those, but right throughout here, we've still got the same pattern of, oh, actually, if you stay there, I'll just run over here quick. So we've got hazel, alder, nitrogen fixing core. It'll share its nitrogen with the hazel. Another row of hazel. Inside that, we've got a bit of a dotted assortment of all sorts of things. This, for example, is a blackcurrant, I think, that one. That's a crab apple. But then at the back end of this system, just coming through here, you can see at knee height, what looks like a line, that's willow. And this whole row, I mean, from that building way over there, which is a, you know, a fair distance, all the way from there, back across here, in front of me, and all the way as far as the far barn, is pretty much filled in with this layer of willow. This will be an inner skin to shelter, but it's got little doorways and archways and stuff in it. It's going to be a nice feature. Again, very, very densely planted. That'll be the inner skin of the shelter belt. That'll be an impenetrable wall. So a certain amount of wind could get through further back towards the camera. By the time the wind gets as far as here, it should be pretty, you know, pretty calm. And in between will be a nice little, relaxed zone. It should be pretty sheltered. Even winter, you can get a huge amount of protection from bare branches. Not when they're little, but a full height oak tree, even when it's bare with no leaves on at all, will reduce wind speed by 60%. Now imagine that with like 100-mile-an-hour wind. That's dramatic. So you can imagine an entire row of alder trees as closely planted as we've got them, even with bare leaves in winter, 100-foot high. There's not a lot of wind going to be coming through that. It's a huge difference, makes a massive difference, especially with the climate being as unstable as it is. Storms are going to be becoming more regular. It's wear and tear on everything in the system. Here, the wind is a limiting factor. So that's why we go with 10,000 trees. That 10,000 trees isn't counting all the willow. It's just things like this, things that will be planted as bare root. So we've still got, again, a huge gap between the willow and the hazel coming through here. That's going to be, potentially be a hugely productive space. We can put all sorts of stuff in there, but mostly we're going to divide it up into little, I'm going to start looking a bit more. We can start dividing that up into almost like room-like spaces that we can put, small buildings into. We can camp in them, things like that. Again, more of the pine. These are pretty much a nurse species. When they get big enough, we bend them over, we peg them to the ground, and as they grow out, that gives us a nice curved beam that when we cut it out in later life, gives us a really nice, interesting building material that we can put into like a cob wall or something like that, and give us something that, is a bit different from, the convention. See, there's a few relics from previous experiments. There's a few of the red willow took, but really there should be a huge row of them all the way around here. All failed over the course of about 2 years. As soon as the roots got down and they hit that impenetrable layer of stone, that was it, they failed. So at this point, we're going to follow this line, which is still continuing, of hazel, alder, hazel, and it comes right over until we get as far as here. At this point, this is a little kick out of the shelter belt system. So we've got, this is all alder coming through here, and below that we've got, as an understory, this is Elaeagnus ebbingi. It's Ebbing silverberry is another name. It's a close relative of autumn olive. It's actually about to lose its leaves properly. You can see one or two of them have, some of the smaller ones. So they'll, there we go. See this one, you can see it's just putting its new leaves on now. So it's looking a bit raggy, but they're incredibly wind fast, very tough. And we've got them all through a row as an understory under this alder. So the alder densely planted, but we can pollard them at a reasonable height so they don't get too high, to provide a huge amount of protection into the front of this building, this being the toilet block. With that being a pretty aggressive wind direction, obviously it slams straight into the front of the building. So in time, this will come up and give us a massive amount of protection, even in winter, for that building, and also for the production of, you can see we've got some nice trellised apple trees, that just, nice bit of protection for them, no bad thing. So this section here is alder, the Ebbing silverberry, and then there's the odd thing on the outside, like this. This is an old strip of gorse. This is probably going to be moved at some point, but it's fine where it is for the moment. I like the idea of being able to pick sloes on site, but this is from an earlier planting, and this is key. We planted a lot of stuff in 2018 that's been moved since. You don't have to be afraid of planting trees and then moving them. There's quite a few here are going to be moved, especially in this particular corner. Quite a few are going to be moved. It's not a big deal, especially with the things like this that went in as bare root trees. They've gone through a selection process. A lot of them died off. These are the survivors that are suited to the site. So at this point, we could transplant them into an area that's more suited for them. It's not a massively productive species to be here, in almost a zone 2-ish kind of area. We've got apple trees, we've got a lot of human interaction, a lot of human activity here. Something that gives us a yield once a year should be tucked away in a further corner rather than, right up here. But these are from the very early days of layout of the croft, when it was just get as many trees into the ground as we could. Some of them have changed as the design has evolved and changed over time. Now, when we hit this point, there are no trees in this corner here. The reason being that I want to get as much solar access into this building as I can. We're going to have a couple of, I don't go into too much detail here, but we're going to get a couple of innovations going into a shower that's being built, and for that we need a decent amount of solar access. So there's the few trees that have gone in here, for example. are going to have to be moved. This is a gorse, so they're going to have to be moved. It's like the best one we've got. They're going to be moved just so that as they grow up and get bigger, we haven't got them casting shade onto that system even in winter. We want absolutely as much as possible solar gain coming in even in winter, because really, I mean, that is the arc of the sun in winter. It's very narrow, it's very low, and we still want to keep a little bit of that into that building as much as possible. So we'll walk around this side, but just to explain, as I say, there isn't, see, it's that time of year. There isn't a huge amount of trees here because we want to keep it completely open. This is the southern tip of the site. The site's like a diamond pointed south. So now we're at the southernmost tip. So here again, a couple of trees, gorse, survivors, they need to be transplanted at some point. It's not top of our list. In fact, while we're here, we've got a nice little wildlife pond here right at the top of the site. That's going to stay. That might even be expanded on at some point. Tadpoles are just out now. So that's a nice little spot, just because we've got to have everything that's relatively low. We don't want anything too high that's going to cause shade onto the building. So, you know, that's a nice little spot. It's going to be developed. So from that small wildlife pond across, we've actually got the shelter belt species coming in again. So here, for example, we've got, oh, there we go, that is an aspen, we've got birch, we've got hazel, we've got mountain ash, you know, rowan, all sorts of stuff, multi-species shelter belt. But really, some of these will be moved or taken out. It's just that at the point that they're being put in, I wanted to be on the safe side and made it a bit further in this direction than was strictly necessary until we get the shower system in and just how much solar access we're going to need and so on. So I'd rather put them in than not, which is why they're here. And it also gives us shelter in the meantime. Now, actually, here's a good example. Here is a relic from earlier plantings. It's actually been cut relatively recently. This is the stump of a Bowles hybrid willow. It's a high biomass variety. We cut them in the last couple of weeks for another project, but there was originally a long line of them all the way down here and out the skin. There will be again at some point in the future. It's just that because it's a very challenging environment for them out here, until the shelter belts in to give them a certain amount of protection, it's just, you know, we're not throwing resources at them, but we will again fill it in at some point. So through this area here will be kept relatively clear. Shelter belt on this side, and this is the outside of the site. Everything of ours is on the inside. So there'll be a row of willow, there'll be a gap, and then we've got the main shelter belt. The reason being that we've got the capacity then to bring animals through here should we choose, and we could run electric fencing through here with just a minimal prune back without having a hack entail bushes back. It'll be much, much simpler. This shelter belt here is still the original shelter. So the same species I've already mentioned. I mean, you can see just within a few weeks, the grasses will be so high you won't be able to see much of this. Is why we're doing it today, even though it's a bit overcast, it's a bit cold, because it's now or never, because they will disappear under the grasses. Once it starts in summer here, it's fast. But at this time of the year, you can see just how much we've got. We've got hazel, rowan, we've got crabapple, a lot of willow. You can see how many willow cuttings have come in over the years. We've got bird cherry, we've got pine and so on. We've got oak, there we go. So that's a little oak tree there. We got, all sorts of native species. Some of them will eventually, all of these won't survive to adulthood. Some of them will die off, but you can see just how densely planted this shelter belt is. A lot of it's going to stay in place for, wildlife use. Hedgerow and tree belts are an incredibly scarce commodity in any typical landscape these days. Something like this, this densely planted mixed species, is really useful, really beneficial. But at this point, we are just level with the back of the toilet block. So at this point, we're back into the high productivity, fast growing stuff with the other species as a backbone to it. So here, for example, we've got this row here. This is alder. This continues from here to the very bottom of the field. This densely planted, maybe 2.5 feet apart, all the way down. On the inside of it, all the ones that you see with tree guards on this side, these are hazel. So as well as all the hazel that were from the barn all the way far across the toilet block, that's a good couple of hundred hazel. We've also got them from here. This is the first one, just sticking out above it. That's the first hazel. That extends all the way down to the bottom of the field and beyond, but we'll get to that when we get there. It is hundreds and hundreds of trees. And these are our breeding program. So they won't all survive. The survivors are the ones that we want. Those that nut out early and actually produce a crop early on, those are the ones that we want to select then for breeding onwards. So it's a good shelter belt species, but it's also a breeding program in and of itself. A lot of these hazels we grew up from seed ourselves. A lot of this actually was done for very little. It's 10,000 trees. It cost us maybe a couple £100, maybe, and most of that was front loaded before we were, bringing our own seed and our own nuts and so on. So you don't have to spend a huge amount as long as you've got the time to take your time. So we've also got a load of currants as an understory. They are, hundreds. Currant, I'm bored of saying the word. You get the idea. There's another one there, all the way down in between on the inner edge alongside the hazel. Again, something else. They'll come up a currant maybe to almost my sort of height, decent sized shrub. Hazels between will of course be, maybe twice my height. So between the two of them, so we'll have, if we want to, we could have an outer skin of the taller tree. So here, for example, we've got, I think that's a birch, we've got a crabapple, we've got a rowan, we've got another crab, we've got willow, another birch. So there's an oak there. So you see all, tall overstory trees. They're all pollard well as well, they all coppice well. So we've got options there just to keep it low enough that we're not casting ourselves into shade, because you see directly behind me is the house and the zone 1 systems that we definitely don't want to be in the shade. But underneath them, if they're managed well, we've still got the height of the hazel and the currants that aren't an issue. The hazel at full height here won't cast shade as far as the house, so we can have full height hazel trees here being cycled through the system that are just producing nuts year after year after year. And the same pattern continues all the way down this row. It's a huge amount of trees. We've still got, every one of these guards is a hazel, every one of those guards is an alder. Now that alder will become a massive tree, too big. And as that's coppiced and as that's pollarded and managed, that way over time, it produces firewood, it produces pole wood for us for construction, it produces a huge amount of nitrogen fixation for all the trees that we got out here. You can see with the winds we got, there's a lot of guards have come off, so I need to come up at some time and go through it all. But in fact, that's happening soon because the grass is about to come up and dwarf it all. But you can see all the way down here just how densely planted they are. There's hundreds and hundreds of trees, and for every tree there's probably 2 or 3 shrubs. So it's a massive number. These, the ones that we had from a neighbour, you can see, that's a pretty substantial rootstock. These were easily my height and above, but being brought out of a protected spot and up onto the hillside, we coppiced them, brought them low, and this is their 2nd year after going in. So you can see how well they've recovered, how far they're coming on. So they're a good resource to have. Excuse me. Yeah, it's more or less more of the same all the way down. We've got, here you go, here's another currant. So as time goes on and all of these start to develop and they start giving us more and more yields, it gives us more and more options. Now some of the species we've got in here are not particularly grazing friendly to all species, so we've got to be careful with that. We don't want to put animals through here that are going to end up eating things that they're toxic to. Throughout this whole strip of shelter belt, this is the southeastern boundary. You can see behind me where we've got the swale rows going along. This is how the croft is divided up into grazing areas and into production areas of trees on the swales. Because these are so densely planted, especially once the growth is up, it's very easy to step on them. So we got these caps in at these locations, just so we know that's a nice little crossing point. We've got currants and things in. If they get stepped on, it really doesn't matter. But you're not going to kill any trees. So for every swale, there's one of these. And like the gap between this shelter belt and the willow that's just behind the camera, this is a point that we could at some point bring electric fence through, so we could actually, between each swale block, being controlled by fencing and being able to graze underneath it and rotate animals through it, we can do the same thing out here. So we can put electric fencing through or permanent fencing through this, and we could break it up into blocks that we could graze, not sheep or a cow or anything substantial, but the smaller stuff like geese or poultry, geese or ducks or chickens. So we could graze them through, no problem. So from this point on, we're not creating a winter sun shadow for the house, because by the time the sun comes up to the point that's actually visible behind the barn, it's actually cleared this section of shelter belt anyway. So we're getting a bit more productive stuff coming in here, because it doesn't need to be coppiced regularly like everything further up does. All of the ones with the yellow caps, which are an overstory through this whole strip, along with a few others, we'll come to them when we do. These are a wild pear, Pyrus communis. It's a very hardy rootstock that we can graft a more beneficial, more useful to us pear further down the line, that we can, have for our own use. But it's something that we're going to get into the ground now, so the further down the line, when we can afford to buy really fancy pear genetics, hopefully, we've got something that we can graft them to, rather than having to go and buy expensive trees now. We've already got them in the ground, so we can get them up quickly further down the line. There's a bit of a theme of that across the whole system. It's been done very inexpensively. So we've got that as an overstory. From this point, we've still got then the same pattern of hazel and currant underneath. So we're not going to run out of currants anytime soon. Now this point here, the hazel makes a bit of a bulge out here into the pasture itself, comes back into the shelter belt, and then comes back out into the pasture here. So there's a nice big crescent shape. The idea being that I don't want to have just a completely straight inner edge of the shelter belt running up and down, because then you've got a situation where you've got the potential for the wind to be accelerated. Say it's coming down the hill, it can just accelerate straight down, and that can cause damage. You're channeling the wind at that point. So what we've got instead is we've got, the odd little thing like this, a little bump out that creates a nice, disrupts all of that happening, but also, because this is the longest single run of shelter belt that we've got. But also, it's a nice little spot that we could put a yurt in here, we could park a tiny house in here, we could put a tent in here, we could put a nice little structure just to sit in, just something nice. Or we could have animal housing in here, or we could put a nice little pond with a nice bench to sit at. It gives us options. It's a nice protected space with that, kind of protected kind of feel, because you've got protection from the wind from just about every single direction, apart from obviously that way. It also means that in summer, if you sit here, you've got behind that barn, which will one day be finished and will look picturesque, I promise, that is where the sun comes up and where the sun goes down. So you've got that as a nice backdrop and a nice view as well. But it's the same pattern even through here. So we've got, like that for example, is a beech. We've got a lot of beech in this as well. There we go, see, another currant. So again, hazel and currants on the inside, everything else on the inside. Oh no, on the inside of the system, and then everything else on the inside of the shelter belt. There's two insides. So same pattern all the way down. At some point we do start getting into a bit more variation. So here for example, we've got some from an earlier system. This is the buckthorn. This is cheap bare root genetics. They always make them male for some reason. So we've got some really nice female sea buckthorn that they haven't got any males. So these will be transplanted over to give them company, because you need about one male to every 3 female. So we'll keep them going through the system. But again, at this point you start to see just how you can get 10,000 trees onto 5 acres. If you want good, solid, dense tree systems, you can't plant trees at the density that you want them to be eventually. You need to plant them at a much greater density than that, because they need to provide shelter to each other and get up. Not everything will survive. You don't want everything to survive, and you plant some things, like I have, that you actually intend to cull in time. This is a grand fir. This is one that will probably stay. It actually has a really useful product. As it gets bigger, it starts forming little blisters on the bark that are full of a resin, and that very liquid resin has got a load of medicinal uses. It's really good on wounds. I've always really admired it, so we've got a few of them. There's a few other species like that we're going to be coming in as well that aren't anything you'd necessarily think of as directly useful, but I love it. I mean, yeah, anyway. So we've got 3 of them dotted through the system as well. We're still, even down here, if I'm walking through and I kick a currant and a bit snaps off, it's like, oh dear, stick it in the ground. Chances are it'll take. That's what these are. They'll be swamped at the moment, but within 2 or 3 years, they'll be up to here with an established root system down through the turf. So when I cut them at ground level at that point, they'll come back up more aggressively and get clear of the turf really quickly. It's you can establish these things straight into grassland. Here's another grand fir, but again, we've still got the older all the way through. I mean, we've been walking past it the whole way. You can see just how many hundreds of alder trees have gone in, and the hazel. It's a colossal number of trees. We've got, oh, here we go. This is, that I think is an Antonovka apple. Now, an Antonovka is a Siberian / Russian kind of species from that region. It's incredibly cold hardy. It's a very good rootstock, and it does actually have a pretty decent apple itself, but more importantly it breeds true from seed. So you can take the apples from them and they stand a much greater chance, because they could be pollinated by any of our other apples. If you had just pure Antonovka, you could use them seed exactly as is. But it does mean that because they breed true to seed, there's a greater chance of us having a good apple from an Antonovka crossed with a good desirable like eating apple. But also we can graft to them, and it confers some of that extreme cold resistance that you get from a Siberian variety onto the apple itself. So we can push that envelope a little bit. But also it means that if we had a really like a severely bitter Arctic blast that was like once every 500 years or something, it just happened to happen within our lifetime, then hopefully that should still cope from the roots and should still regenerate as an apple that's useful. So even though we've lost the fancy, big fancy trees, within a few years we're still back into apple production. And we're doing that with a lot of things. We're really sort of pushing it a little bit in both directions. So things that where it's a bit cold here and things that it's a bit warm here, planting both of those because the climate's shifting rapidly, all sorts of stuff's happening, and it's not quite as simple as just getting varieties from further south and bringing them in. It's becoming a radically different environment entirely. So we've got to establish new systems and new relationships between species that work in, in the reality of things as they are now. At this point, we've got a lot more of this as an earth species. This probably next year we'll pin it down. It'll probably be out to about here or so. So we'll get, a decent, arched beam. I'll show you one or two that we've actually done further along. But again, same pattern all the way along. Now in amongst this lot, at this point, here we go. So that's another, what is that? Actually, I think that might be, it's either a hazel or a hornbeam. There's also a hornbeam through here, forgot to mention that. I haven't seen too many of them, but they are here. Holly. Now, holly's a really interesting one. We've got a lot of holly, from about halfway up that field, all the way down to the bottom and all the way across. As an understory, it performs really well in the shade, and at Christmas time, of course, it does give us, well, the winter generally, it does give us a usable yield in terms of, clips of, holly with, berries on and whatnot. All this stuff has got some sort of yield for us. So, here we go. And that's how easy it is to step on trees when they're this dense. But that's fine. So, right, let's see. That is another wild pear. But also we've got through here, where are we? Here we go. There's one. That is a little teeny tiny chestnut. So from a little ways up here, we've got the chestnut trees start to begin, because that is north behind me. So from this corner all the way around, we haven't got to worry about casting any shade onto our system. It's just a neighbour's pasture, but it doesn't matter so much. So we can plant really tall climax canopy trees that are going to give us a really good yield moving on. There aren't any chestnut trees that are good and reliable here yet. So I've planted a few hundred. We'll see what we do. I keep planting a few hundred every year. The survivors are the ones that we want. Those that actually produce nuts, they're the ones that we want even more, and we'll breed from them. So at this point, I mean, you can see if we come around here, the outer skin remains the same, alder all the way down, but once we get to the inside from this point in, we've got a lot more going on. So we've got, generally, we've got chestnut, hazel, hazel, chestnut, hazel, hazel, chestnut. So you can see how densely planted we are from this point all the way through, and that continues all the way along. So this is a great big nut production system on the inside of the shelter belt. On the outside, we've still got things like this as a nurse crop that will be taken out in time. This is an Italian alder. So we've got a combination of Italian and common alder running right through the system again, right through the whole strip as a support species, giving nitrogen to the whole thing, so it'll grow very quickly and aggressively. And it's a bit more dotted around intentionally down here, so it's not quite so linear. We've got things like the holly, which is actually doing pretty well. We've only lost a couple of them. You know, it takes most things a couple of years here to recover from the shock of just being in the ground, but then they come on more aggressively if they're going to. The holly has been in long enough that we know it's not going to die. It is starting to come. It just takes a little bit of time. So yeah, you can see the density. So there's a holly right there, but there's also a holly here, and there's another one here. There's another one right there. So you can see it's fairly densely planted all the way through this system. So that's just the outer skin with the alder inside it. So we're going for evergreen core on the bottom edge, and it goes quite a ways up the field as well. We will add more as time goes on. It's just, you know, the trees have money, cost money, and we did buy. That was one of the more expensive elements, because holly's very difficult to grow yourself. It's just one of those things we just had to invest a bit of money in. But it's a massively useful tree, and it's evergreen, so it just, of course, never drops its leaves. It's relatively wind fast. Once it's got a little bit of protection, it should come up quite nicely. And that's just really the outer skin understory to the alder. And then we've still got scope in here for a little bit of understory, of course. We could put some currants through if we wanted, but there are lots of them. That is an Antonovka apple, but mostly through here, so that's a pear, but mostly it's all the ones that you see with the white guards on. They are the chestnut and hazel. So it'll be the chestnut as an overstory, as a full height tree. Then below that, the chestnuts, not with full spacing between them, occupying the same space. So if you think of it, instead of it being an acre of chestnuts and then an acre of hazel, it's an acre of chestnuts with an acre of hazel underneath it. So you've got them systems layered up, and it probably won't be as productive as hazels out in the clear sun, but it'll produce some. And of course here, even as an understory, the sun arcs across the sky there. So this being slightly in front of the chestnut, it will get a certain amount of direct sun just from coming in from the sides. As we've got the option with the chestnut overstory of taking some of the branches out anyway, and we can, you know, play that game when the time comes. But they won't all survive. And I keep coming back to this. Hang on, you can see just how many. That is probably this year, maybe towards the end of this year, we might pin that one down. And when you can see, that's, yeah. It wants to lie in this direction, so we just encourage it down. We peg it to the ground with a cord. We have to move the cord occasionally because it will tend to strangle the tree, but that's going to be huge. Oh, here's a good example of just the odd random. That's a horse chestnut, and horse chestnut is a source of natural saponins. You can crush the conkers up in water, and you can do the same thing with the leaves to a much milder product, and it'll actually give off its saponins. So you've got the potential for doing all sorts of stuff with that, including you can stun fish if you want to go fishing with it. You know, if you needed to, it's a nice option. Or of course you can do laundry, you know. It's nice to have it in as resilience, you never know. So again, we're into, what's that? That's actually a cherry. Yes, there we go. We've got some wild cherries starting to come in through this as well. I knew there was some. We've got an Antonovka apple. We've got a lot of bird cherry. There's another beech. Now, here we go. So here's one that I've tied down ready. So you can see that's been tied off. That's been moved fairly recently. Yeah, you can see it started to, maybe you can't. Come in a bit closer. So you can see that actually started to girdle it. So that got moved relatively recently. It's a wooden peg in the ground just holding it down. But it's not stopped growing. It is still growing. So if I take this off the tip, you can see that by the time this has grown out a little bit further and then gone vertical again, because it will, we've got a really nice, let's say that's grown out to the same sort of thickness as my leg. Then you've got a nice curved beam. That'll be a nice nice support piece in like a cob building or something. Be beautiful. And also in the meantime, we've got the shelter down low and spread out, which is where we need it currently, just to get these things up above 5 or 6 foot height, because we don't currently have a deer problem, but they're coming. Over the last few years, we've seen deer closer and closer and closer. It's going to be a problem, and I'd rather get this core system up above their browse height before it becomes an issue. I don't want to have to fence the entire site with deer fencing. That's a huge expense. But if we have to, we have to. But I'd rather get things up above that height before it becomes an issue, just so that it's, you know, less of an issue, if you see what I mean. So again, same pattern. There's a lot of beech starting to come through, but we've still got, oh, here we go. Here's a monkey puzzle tree. We've got 3 of these. Love them. I will probably not live long enough to see the nuts from these trees. I might, if I live into good old age, but you can't rely on that, of course. But yeah, we've got 3 of them. I'd like to put a couple more in. We don't know, you need males and females, we don't know which gender we've got until they start bearing. At that point, really, if we've got all males, well, we'll have to start again, and it could easily be 50, 60 years before they start giving reliable crops. So another, good span of time to wait. But, not everything gives guaranteed results. Sometimes you've got to stick them in and hope that it's going to work out, because, there's no guarantees. It's better to plant them and be, potentially someone else be disappointed in 40, 50 years than to not plant them. No one's definitely going to get any nuts if I don't plant them, so they're in. I'd like to get a few more, but, it's a start. At this point, we've got, I should explain, right. This large expanse here, it's a big area. It's easily an acre. That has been set aside for a very large project further down the line. So it's got good shelter belt all the way around it. It's well positioned right at the bottom of the site. I'm not going to go into any detail on it, but this has been set aside for a very large standalone system. So to separate out, on my left is what's going to be a chicken forest, is becoming a chicken forest, and that system there, which is a very different system, we've got a row of sea buckthorn. Now these sea buckthorn are really interesting. A huge amount of variety. You see the leaf pattern there, and you see the leaf pattern here. They're radically different. These are both female trees. They're both female plants. They're beautiful. There's a huge amount of variety. These came from one of the most unusual breeding programs for sea buckthorn that's in existence today. We've got another swale full of them, but we've got a row of them from this shelter belt just up as far as just this side of the duck pond, really. So there must be, 10, 15 of them. These are the results. These are the berries from a breeding program. The intent was to produce a large fruit, a large berry. So we got the seeds, we planted them. These are the ones that have done well. And see, some of them are really starting to come on nicely. So I'm hoping that some of them will give us really good large fruited varieties that are suitable for an extreme climate like a remote hillside in Caithness. And that'll give us varieties that should do just about anywhere well in the UK. It was our first breeding program, and we're probably pretty close to starting to find out whether it's been successful or not. The other two being, of course, the chestnuts and the hazel. But it's an interesting one, so I thought I'd show it, even though, strictly speaking, this isn't actually in the shelter belt. Although, you can see the male sea buckthorn, this is where they're coming over to. We've put 1 or 2 in already, just to give them, a decent chance of pollination. But it's a really good system. But as we go further in here, now we're into the chicken forest. So the outer skin, we've got, all sorts of stuff starting to come in. So we've got a lot of berries. This is Saskatoon. That is a pear. There's something growing on that. What's that? It's just a few bugs. So, and a bit of windburn. So yeah, this is a Saskatoon, which is a really good, reliable, prolific bearer of fruit here. Even in the conditions that we've got, it's been, I can't say enough nice things about it. We've got, on the outside still, you can see an earlier planting of all these. See, they're a little bit bigger. Inside 2 years, they'll be the same height as the ones in the first system that we came in through. They'll be huge. Everything inside this will have a massive amount of protection, including the nurse trees, the pine trees. So they'll get protection, they'll give protection, everything will grow much more quickly. But that is north, so we need massive protection on this side. So we've got the older double skin. So one here, one here, one here, one here, 2 rows, closely spaced. So as they grow together and really densely planted, that'll give us a massive amount of protection. We've got, as I say, these will be taken out eventually anyway, but inside that we've got a small area of overstory trees. So that's a cherry, that is a pear, there's also Antonovka apple. Again, these are fairly closely spaced. If they, at the point they start crowding each other out, we either select, prioritize one over the other and just cut the other, or we can dig it out and move it or sell it. It gives us options, but probably some of them will die off anyway. We've got, again, another monkey puzzle within this system, but then On the south side of that, right now we're into the main block of the chestnut and hazel. I got a whole video on this going in. There's hundreds of them. You can see just how many of them. If you put a quick sweep around just to show how many nut trees we got in this really quite narrow space. All the ones with the clear plastic guards, those little mini greenhouse ones, each one of them is either hazel or a chestnut. There's a lot of trees, hundreds of chestnut trees in this system. We've also got other bits and pieces like morello cherry, which again, once the chestnut trees come up as an overstory, the hazel will actually still perform well as an understory, so will the morello. This is why we've got it in quite a few of the shelter belt plantings that are closer to the house systems that we come to fairly often. Morello does well here, and I think it's a really good eating cherry. I really like morello. It's going to be a sour cherry. It's beautiful, I love it. But anyway, so these will continue to do well. We did have one of them that failed, but we've got this one and another one there. You can see they're actually in blossom now. We've had some pretty major wins. They don't seem to care. It's a really tough tree. I really like morello. It needs a lot of shaping. You know, these, you can see the crisscrossing and so on. It hasn't been a priority till now. Now we've got the bulk plantings in, I can start looking after these a little bit more, because I'd like these to be a bit more productive than they are. So, Antonovka apple, Saskatoon, that's actually alive. That is a, let me think, what is that? That is a Josterberry. We got a lot of Josterberry because we had hundreds of cuttings, and I've got another load to go in. So we're just walking through, I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of nut trees. So as they come up and start providing cover, this whole area in time, the chickens will be rotationally grazed through. So they'll come through, scratch out all the bugs underneath, any June drop, any immature fruit, anything that's got pests, all drop into the ground, they'll take out. They will also scratch through and, through and around the comfrey. And you can see this is a dwarf comfrey. This was actually mis-sold to me. This was sold to me as Bocking 14. This is anything but sterile. This spreads aggressively. It's luckily, I recognised in time, managed to move it successfully, which can be an issue once it's established, so I was quite lucky. And I've transplanted it down here because it's so prolific. It's just at the point that it needs to be spread now. So I want this to cover this entirety of this system to replace the grass. So we've got this as a fodder crop and a forage that all the poultry can come through as well. We've also got a few other bits and pieces. Medicinal plants for, this is tansies. That's a medicinal plant for the chickens. They will scritch it out completely given half a chance. So we'll put a mesh cage around it so the chickens can just, you know, peck through it a little bit. And they are, you see, so for example, we've got one here, we've got one right there. Got another one here. We've got another one here. My point being they're regularly spaced. So when we put the fencing through, eventually for the rotational grazing of the poultry, into each of the runs they're going into, they'll have access to tansy. We've got a few other species to put in as well, but we had these, so we've put them into where they're eventually going to go. I tend to throw just about every type of comfrey we've got in here. So this is actually a Bocking 14 that was brought in by mistake. But there's a few of them dotted about. So as we get into this system, you can see these are just plain canes. For the most part, these are all currants. So we've got a row of Josterberry, and there's probably about, I don't know, 10, 15 of them. Row of Josterberry, we've got a row of, I think, white currants, red currants, black currants. That'll be added to again over time, which is why there's a bit of a gap between this and the nut trees, just so we've got another two types of currant ready to come in. But I'm going to go over to the northwestern edge of the shelter belt. Now, strictly speaking, I'd like this to behave very much like the big trees with all the chestnuts and all the rest of it, but we've got the telephone cable coming in. Now, we don't actually use that cable anymore. We don't have a service coming in from it, but we kind of still have a duty of care towards that company. You know, it's not ours and we can't have our trees trashing it, you know. That's not friendly, and it causes dispute and it draws attention that's negative, so we'd rather avoid it. So what we've got underneath it is, again, we've got alder, which, as I say, will top 100 feet easily. but again, it'll coppice and it'll pollard very readily, so we can bring it at keep it at a reasonable height so it's not going to threaten the power lines, the telephone lines. And we've got hazel below that, but not as densely screened as the other side. Through the rest of it, it's not. But these are earlier trees; they're not part of the breeding program. Oh, I should mention, in front of all the trees, I've got 6 of these. They're much more widely spaced. These are also hazel trees, but these are my stud genetics. These came from specifically selected trees that had been bred for large nuts in a similar climate to ours. I think they came from Wales. So I had them, these are about 2 years until they went into the ground. So over time, theoretically, these will give the potential for the better, the larger nuts into our, the varieties that we're trying to grow. So again, we've got Antonovka apple. Yeah, it's all sorts. This is mostly understory species in here now. So a lot of them are difficult to spot, but that is a Saskatoon, Juneberry. And then we're into the rows of the currants again. So it's, same as behind the camera. So this is, that isn't. That is Josterberry and so on. White currant, red currant, black currant. We've also got a black elder. We've got a few, the geese have seen me. We've also got the black elder, and we've got a few other elders dotted about. Some of them are quite small, but the chickens really like elderberry, so, all a good thing. We've also got some Siberian pea. We're struggling a little bit with Siberian pea. Got a few theories about why, so I'm trying something different this year. But in time, these particular, all this section of the currants will have an overstory, because currants will fruit quite well in a dapple shade. They'll have an overstory of Siberian pea, because that's a really amazing fodder crop for chickens, and is very wind fast and very cold hardy, so it's perfect here. I think our biggest problem here is winter waterlogging. So I've got to come up with I've got a few options to get the Siberian pea above the waterlogging, but I can grow it in other places that are better, drier, but I want it here in the chicken forage system so they can self-forage for it, at least some of them. So I've got a plan for that, but we'll come to that when I put that in place. And then we're into the chicken forage system. So really, at this point, as well as the problem of trying to keep it short from the power, from the telephone cable, we also have the situation where beyond pretty much here, so this is a hazel, which is a fairly short tree. The last of the alder is actually here, because just to my right is where the pipe from the septic goes through. So I don't want anything to interfere with that. So what we got instead is the other side of the lane. So we'll go over there and then we'll just film that section. So now I'm on the track leading up to the croft. So this is actually outside the shelter belt. But if we just look around here quickly, you can see there's the black elder we were just looking at. That's the whole nut trees. And this is the last section coming up here that we had to stop because we had to stop short of the septic. Now, this is the septic ditch itself. So, because obviously we're going to have a big gap in the shelter belt there, and if you've got really good shelter belt everywhere but there's a gap, the wind's going to howl through it. It's going to exacerbate the problem. So the septic ditch, which of course is a high nutrient system, we've got willow hybrid, Bowles hybrid willow grown along that, and it puts on 2 or 3 meters a year easily. As it develops and gets bigger, that'll get even more aggressive, and it'll give us a huge amount of protection and give us a yield every single year. But we're also restoring this entire hedgerow to something more like it would have been once upon a time. So we've got a huge multi-species hedgerow coming through here. We have to keep them relatively low because we have to keep them clear of the power lines. We're not going to pass that on to anyone else. We planted the trees, we'll maintain them. But you can see where we've started to maintain the old system as well. That was going to die. So we've taken it there. In a few years, we'll take it even lower down once it's recovered a little bit, and it'll regenerate again. So something that you can see it's like 3/4 dead. That'll coppice, it'll regenerate, and it'll live for decades and decades, centuries even. So we've also planted in species that we see growing in the other hedgerows round and about. So it's more like it would have been once upon a time, but we've also added more stuff ourselves. There's a lot of elder, and underneath it all, we're growing a huge amount of comfrey. Now, Can't have too many, can't have too much comfrey. It's so useful. We're also, slowly salvaging old building stone that's been thrown away over the years. But you can see just how much comfrey we've got coming through. Over time, it will replace the dock, which we want some dock, just there's a bit too much. So the comfrey coming through, and we've still got, let's have a look. Here we are. Right, so there's currants. There's just so much. But these are apple. All of these that have got the guards on are apple. So all of this again will be a productive hedgerow all the way along the line. Inside the system, this all still needs to be tidied up and dealt with. But inside that, the wall is temporary, that won't be here forever. But the other side of that is a hedgerow that you can't see without going over. There's nothing to see as yet. But they just come peeking over the wall here of Elaeagnus ebbingi again, Ebbing silverberry, and that'll be a dense hedge that'll be up to maybe 3 or 4 meters all the way along here. So that for the house will be really, really, really good storm protection. That'll almost be as high as the house by the time it's finished. Very dense, very strong, very wind fast, especially during the middle of the winter when we need it the most. So we'll have a double skin. Won't be very high, of course, because you have to keep it on the power cable, but we have a double skin shelter belt right against the house, where we can't have the depth that we want because we've got to keep the road open, of course. Can't plant trees on it. So we've got a double skin of very, very thick, strong planting, so that no matter what happens, and again, that is from basically where parallel with our land begins, all the way up to where our right of access ends. This whole section will be very dense, as well as the inner, to reinforce the gaps that we've got because of our infrastructure coming through, like spaces for the house and the septic and the gap for the car park. So again, this shelter here is all that stands at this point between the wind and our car park. But at this point, we're clear of the power, so the trees can go full height, or more height anyway. So again, that isn't a problem. And by the time this isn't our land, of course, but by the time we're onto neighbours' land, it doesn't matter so much, because by then we're back into this original section of shelter belt. There is a small gap here. I've got plans for a nice high status tree to go here. That's for a future project, so I've kept that open for it. But apart from that, that is the entirety. And it's easy when you're walking around the bottom of the field to think, the tiny little trees, how long is that going to take to get up? Just a couple of years. That's all these took. At that point, everything inside becomes more productive. But also the shelter belt design itself is a multi-layered approach, giving us all kinds of yields. This in particular, for example, gives us all kinds of fruit, all kinds of yields of firewood and things from the willow. Amazing plant. You can't have too much willow. And and of course gives us nice sheltered walking space up to the pods and so on, all within a shelter belt. The top section gives us a huge amount of nuts, and it gives us a load of fruit, and again it gives us a load of willow. Down the other side gives us fruit, masses of fruit, gives us nuts, and gives us, there's yields all the way around, and all of it can be undergrazed by animals, all of it can be foraged by animals. So we can rotationally graze the chickens, the ducks, the geese through sections of it, and actually get a yield off them as well as having the benefit of course, calming that wind. There's two ways you can look at running all of your systems, your entire house, on wind and solar. You can spend tens of thousands of pounds putting in wind turbines and solar panels, or you can harvest the sun and the wind the way it's been done for millennia. Trees. The wind bends them, they create microfractures, they put on more material, it grows thicker, they grow stronger. You're growing biomass from the wind itself. The solar panel, they've got millions of solar panels pointed at the sun. That's what they do. You're converting wind and solar energy into biomass that you can run your systems on. It's a lot cheaper. Anyway, there's a quick walk through, that was a walk through our shelter belt systems and the thinking behind it, and the diversity of yields that we expect to get from it over the next few years.